Lady Zareth H. stood in the docking bay of Alteria station and looked back at the human frigate New Horizon through the transparent aluminum windows. The ship looked small and battered compared to the sleek Alterian vessels around it, but she knew now that appearances could be very deceiving. Inside that modest vessel were some of the bravest and most honorable people she had ever met. The luxury transport that would take her home to the Alterian homeworld waited nearby with its crew of servants and guards. Her family had spared no expense to ensure her comfort during the journey, and the ship was filled with all the finest things that wealth and noble status could provide. But somehow, the rich furnishings and expensive decorations seemed less important than they had before. Commander Veltar stood beside her, reviewing the official reports that would be filed about the rescue mission. The paperwork made everything sound clean and simple, but Zareth knew the reality had been much more complicated. Numbers and dates could not capture the courage Jake Martinez had shown or the way his crew had risked everything for strangers. "The transport is ready to depart whenever you wish, my lady," the commander said respectfully. "Your father, Lord Kethara, is eager to see you safely returned." "I need a few more minutes, Commander," Zareth replied. "There is something I must do before I leave." She walked back through the docking tube that connected the station to the New Horizon and made her way to the medical bay where Jake was getting his wounds treated one final time. Dr. Stevens was removing the last of his bandages and checking that everything had healed properly. "How does it look, Doc?" Jake asked as she examined a deep cut on his forearm. "Clean and healing well," Dr. Stevens replied with satisfaction. "You should have full use of the arm within a week, but try to avoid any more battles for a while." Jake laughed and flexed his fingers to test the movement. "I will do my best, but trouble seems to find me whether I look for it or not." When he noticed Zareth standing in the doorway, his expression became more serious. They had talked many times during the journey to the station, but this felt different. Somehow, both of them knew it was probably the last time they would see each other. "Lady Zareth, I thought you had already left for home," he said as he pulled on his uniform shirt. "I wanted to speak with you alone before I departed," she replied. "Dr. Stevens, would you mind giving us a few minutes?" The doctor smiled and gathered her medical supplies. "Of course, my lady. I have work to do in the other sections anyway." When they were alone, Zareth moved closer to Jake and studied his face carefully. The cuts and bruises from the rescue mission were fading, but she could see the deeper marks that years of service had left on him. There were lines around his eyes from squinting at tactical displays, and scars on his hands from working with dangerous equipment. "Captain Martinez, I came to ask for your forgiveness," she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "My behavior during this journey was shameful and unworthy of my position. You saved my life, and I responded with anger and insults." Jake looked uncomfortable with the formal apology. "Lady Zareth, you were scared and in shock from being captured. People say things they do not mean when they are under stress." "No," she said firmly. "What I said came from prejudice and ignorance, not from fear. I was taught that humans were a primitive species, and I believed it without question. But you and your crew have shown me what real nobility looks like." She paused and took a deep breath before continuing. "In my culture, we are taught that noble blood makes us superior to others. But you have no noble blood, and yet you are the most honorable person I have ever met. You risk your life for strangers and expect nothing in return. That is true nobility." Jake shifted uncomfortably and looked away. "I just do my job, Lady Zareth. Nothing special about that." "Everything is special about it," she replied with passion in her voice. "You could have handed me over to the Corvans and saved your ship and crew. Instead, you chose to fight impossible odds rather than abandon someone you barely knew. How many nobles would make that choice?" Before Jake could answer, she reached out and took his hands in hers. The touch that had once filled her with disgust now felt warm and comforting. His rough, calloused skin told the story of a man who worked hard and fought for what he believed in. When you touched me during the rescue, I felt something I had never experienced before, she said softly. It was not just the physical contact, but what it represented. For the first time in my life, someone was protecting me, not because of my title or my family name, but because it was the right thing to do. Jake looked down at their joined hands, and she could see that her words were affecting him deeply. Lady, Zareth, you do not need to thank me for doing what anyone should do. Protecting innocent people is not heroic. It is basic decency. That is exactly what makes you special, she replied. You think what you do is normal, but it is not. Most people would have found excuses to avoid getting involved. You saw people in trouble and acted without hesitation. She released his hands and stepped back with tears beginning to form in her eyes. I have learned more about honor and courage in 5 days aboard your ship than in 20 years among my own people. You have changed how I see the galaxy and my place in it. Jake reached out and gently wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. You are going to do great things, Lady Zareth. I can see it in you, the strength and wisdom to make a real difference in the galaxy. I hope so, she said with a sad smile. I want to be worthy of the sacrifice you and your crew made for me. When I return home, I will work to change how my people view humans and other species we consider primitive. They stood in silence for a moment, just looking at each other, and thinking about paths that might have been different. In another life or different circumstances, they might have been friends or something more. But duty and responsibility called them in different directions. I should go, Zareth said finally. My transport is waiting, and there are people who want to see me safely home. Take care of yourself, Lady Zareth, Jake replied. The galaxy needs more people like you, ones who are willing to learn and change and grow. She started to leave, but stopped at the door and looked back at him one final time. Captain Martinez, if you are ever in Altarian space and need anything, please contact me. I owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Jake smiled and gave her a small salute. Just knowing you are safe and free is payment enough for me. 6 months later, Jake received a message through official diplomatic channels that surprised him greatly. Lady Zareth had been appointed as special ambassador for human-Altarian relations and was working to establish new trade agreements and cultural exchanges between their peoples. The message was brief and formal, but included a personal note at the end. Captain Martinez, I often think about our conversations and the lessons you taught me about true nobility. Your example guides me every day as I work to build bridges between our species. The barbarian captain has become a legend among my people, though I never tell them that story about touching an Altarian noble without permission. Jake laughed as he read the message and showed it to his crew during their next meal together. Dr. Stevens smiled with satisfaction, while Lisa Chong made jokes about Jake's diplomatic skills. Ben Torres raised his coffee cup in a mock toast to interspecies relations. So what do you think, Captain? Amy Foster asked with a grin. Think we might get invited to some fancy Altarian diplomatic parties. Jake shook his head, but he was smiling too. I think I will stick to what I know best, rescuing people who need help and trying to do the right thing. But he kept the message and read it sometimes when he was alone in his quarters. It reminded him that even small acts of decency could have far-reaching effects. Saving one person from slavery had created a friendship that might help bring two species closer together. The New Horizon continued its missions throughout human space and beyond. Jake and his crew rescued more prisoners from pirates and slavers and helped anyone who needed assistance, regardless of their species or background. They became known as people who could be trusted to do the right thing, even when it was dangerous or difficult. And sometimes, when they visited Altarian space, they would receive special treatment and priority docking privileges. The local officials would be extra polite and helpful, though none of them would explain why. Jake never asked questions, but he suspected that somewhere in the bureaucracy was a note about treating the crew of the New Horizon with special respect. Lady Zarath kept her promise to change how her people viewed humans and other species. She became a powerful voice for equality and cooperation in the Altarian government and worked tirelessly to break down the prejudices that had shaped her own upbringing. Years later, historians would mark the rescue on Zarian Prime as a turning point in human-Altarian relations. But Jake Martinez never thought of himself as making history. He was just a ship captain who tried to help people in trouble and treat everyone with basic dignity and respect. The galaxy was a big and often dangerous place, but it was made a little bit better by people like Jake who chose to do the right thing even when no one was watching. And sometimes when least expected, those small acts of courage and kindness would grow into something much larger and more important than anyone could have imagined. The alarm systems aboard the New Horizon began screaming at exactly 0347, ship time on the third day of their journey to Altarian space. Jake Martinez was pulled from sleep by the harsh sound and rolled out of his bunk, already reaching for his uniform. Years of military service had trained him to wake up ready for action, and his mind was clear before his feet hit the deck. "Captain to the bridge." Amy Foster's voice came through the communication system with barely controlled panic. "We have multiple contacts dropping out of hyperspace around us." Jake ran through the corridors of his ship while pulling on his boots and securing his sidearm. The crew members he passed were all moving with the same urgent purpose as they rushed to battle stations. Everyone knew that contacts appearing this close to their ship meant trouble of the worst kind. The bridge was already busy with activity when Jake arrived. Lisa Chong was at the tactical station, bringing weapons online, while Ben Torres worked to boost power to the shields. Amy Foster stood at the sensor array, with her face pale as she counted the enemy ships surrounding them. "Report," Jake ordered, as he dropped into the captain's chair. 57 Corvan vessels in attack formation," Amy said, without looking up from her screens. "They came out of hyperspace in a perfect ambush pattern, and we are right in the middle of them." Jake felt his blood turn cold as he realized what this meant. The Corvans had somehow tracked his ship from Zarian Prime and brought a massive fleet to get their prisoners back. With nearly 60 enemy ships against his single frigate, the odds of survival were basically zero. "How did they find us?" Lisa asked as she targeted the nearest Corvan destroyer. "We were running silent and using a randomized course. Does not matter now," Jake replied as he studied the tactical display. "What matters is getting out of this alive." "Amy, send a distress signal on all frequencies and prepare to transmit our ship's logs to Fleet Command." As he gave orders, Jake's mind was working through their limited options. The New Horizon was fast and well armed for a ship of her size, but she was not designed to fight an entire fleet. Their only chance was to run and hope they could reach friendly space before the Corvans destroyed them. But even as he prepared to give the order to retreat, Jake knew they would not make it. The enemy ships were already moving to cut off their escape routes, and their weapons were powering up for the attack. In a few minutes, his ship and crew would be nothing but debris, floating in space, in her quarters. Lady Zareth felt the ship's engines change pitch as Jake pushed them to emergency power. She had been awake for hours thinking about her behavior during the rescue and the conversations she had with the crew. The alarm systems and sounds of preparation for battle pulled her from her thoughts and filled her with a familiar fear. She made her way to the bridge against regulations and found the human crew working frantically to prepare for what looked like an impossible fight. Through the main viewer, she could see the dark shapes of Corvan warships moving into attack positions. There were so many of them that they blocked out the stars. "Lady Zareth, you should not be here," Jake said when he noticed her standing near the entrance. "Please return to your quarters and prepare for possible evacuation." "There will be no evacuation while there, Captain," she replied as she stepped closer to his chair. "You are going to fight them even though you cannot win." Jake looked at her with tired eyes that had seen too much death and violence. "Those are Corvin slavers out there, and they want you back. I could hand you over, and they might let my crew live. But that is not going to happen." The simple statement hit Zareth like a physical blow, and she had to grab the back of a chair to steady herself. Jake Martinez was willing to die rather than give her back to the slavers who had captured her. After all the cruel things she had said to him, he was still prepared to sacrifice his life and the lives of his crew to protect her. "Captain, you have a duty to your people," she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I am just one person, and they are many. The logical choice is clear. Logic has nothing to do with it," Jake replied as he turned back to the tactical display. "We do not abandon people to slavers, no matter what the cost. That is who we are." The first Corvin ships opened fire, and the bridge shook as energy bolts struck their shields. Lisa Chang returned fire with everything they had, but the enemy vessels absorbed the hits and kept coming. More ships joined the attack until space around the New Horizon was filled with deadly energy beams. "Shields down to 60%, Ben Torres called out from his engineering station. "I can give you more power, but not for long." Jake nodded and began giving orders that would buy them a few more minutes of life. He rerouted power from non-essential systems and had Amy look for gaps in the enemy formation they could exploit. But everyone on the bridge knew they were just delaying the inevitable. Zareth watched the human crew work together with perfect coordination, even though they all knew they were going to die. No one complained or suggested surrender, and no one blamed her for bringing this disaster upon them. They just did their jobs and trusted their captain to find a way out of an impossible situation. "Captain, I am reading massive energy buildup in the lead Corvin ship," Amy reported. "They are charging some kind of super weapon." Jake cursed under his breath as he realized what the Corvins were planning. They intended to disable his ship with one massive blast and then board it to take the prisoners back alive. Once they had what they wanted, the crew of the New Horizon would be killed or sold into slavery themselves. "All power to forward shields," he ordered. "Brace for impact." But before the Corvin weapon could fire, Zareth H. stepped forward and placed her hand on Jake's shoulder. The touch sent shock waves through both of them for very different reasons. For her, it was the first time she had willingly made physical contact with a human. For him, it was a gesture of trust from someone who had rejected him. "Captain Martinez, there is something I must tell you," she said in a voice that carried across the bridge. "I have access to encrypted Altarian military communication channels. If there are any of my people's ships in this sector, I can call for help." Jake turned to look at her with something like hope beginning to show in his eyes. "You have been holding this back until now. I did not think you deserved my help," she admitted with shame clear in her voice. "But I was wrong about many things, and I cannot let good people die because of my pride." Without waiting for permission, Zareth moved to Amy's communication station and began entering access codes that only Altarian nobility possessed. Her fingers flew over the controls as she opened channels that were normally reserved for military emergencies and diplomatic crises. "This is Lady Zareth of House Velthera, requesting immediate assistance," she broadcast on the emergency frequency. "I am aboard the human vessel New Horizon, under attack by current slavers at coordinates 7-7- Mark-4-1. For long seconds there was no response, and Zareth began to fear that no Altarian ships were close enough to help. But then a familiar voice crackled through the speakers, and filled her with relief she had never thought possible. Lady Zareth, this is Commander Veltar of the patrol cruiser Starfire. We received word of your disappearance and have been searching for you. Hold your position. We are en route with a full battle group. The effect on the bridge was immediate and dramatic. The crew of the New Horizon had been preparing to die, and suddenly they had hope for survival. Jake looked at Zareth with something like gratitude while his officers began coordinating with the incoming Altarian ships. Jake Martinez stood in the medical bay of the New Horizon and listened to Lady Zareth explain how he had dishonored her by touching her during the rescue. Her words cut deeper than the wounds he had received fighting through the Corvin compound, and he felt anger building in his chest like a fire. "Let me get this straight," he said when she finished speaking. "You are angry because I saved your life. You are a primitive species, and you touched me without permission." Zareth replied with her chin raised high. "In Altarian culture, this is the greatest insult possible. You have tainted my honor and maid. Am unclean." Jake looked at her for a long moment and then shook his head. His uniform was still bloody from the rescue, and he had not yet been treated for his injuries. 3 of his Marines were in the surgery bay, getting patched up, and one of them might not make it through the night. All of this had happened because he wanted to save innocent people from slavery. Unclean. He repeated the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. Right. He turned to leave the medical bay, but stopped at the door and looked back at her. "Dr. Stevens will take good care of you, Lady Zareth. Try not to let her touch you either, or you might have to file another complaint." After Jake left the medical bay became very quiet. Dr. Kate Stevens continued working on Zareth's minor injuries, while the Altarian noble sat stiff and silent on the examination table. The doctor was a small woman with gray hair and gentle hands who had been treating wounded soldiers for 20 years. "Captain Martinez is a good man," Dr. Stevens said as she cleaned a cut on Zareth's arm. "He has risked his life many times to help people he has never met before. The crew would follow him anywhere. He is a barbarian who does not understand proper behavior," Zareth replied coldly. "His actions have brought shame upon my family name." Dr. Stevens stopped working and looked at the alien woman with something like pity in her eyes. "Your family name will survive Lady Zareth H. But you might not have if he had not acted quickly. That compound was rigged with explosives and would have blown up 10 minutes after we left." The words hit Zareth like a physical blow, but she tried not to show it. She had not known about the explosives, and the idea that she had been so close to death was frightening. But admitting that the human captain had truly saved her life would mean accepting that she had been wrong about everything. The next 3 days were the longest of Zareth's life. The trip to Altarian space should have been peaceful and comfortable, but instead it was filled with tension and awkward silences. The human crew tried to be polite to her, but she could see the anger in their eyes when they thought she was not looking. Lieutenant Lisa Chong was the worst of them all. She barely spoke to Zareth, and when she did her voice was cold and professional. During meals in the ship's dining area, Lisa would sit as far away as possible and talk loudly about how ungrateful some people could be. "I cannot believe," she complained. About being rescued, Lisa said to Ben Torres during one meal, "If someone saved my life, I would at least say thank you. Some people do not know how to be grateful." Ben replied while looking directly at Zareth. "They think the whole galaxy revolves around them and their fancy titles." Zareth tried to ignore their comments, but they stung more than she wanted to admit. She had been raised to believe that her noble birth made her special, and that other species should respect her position. But these humans clearly did not care about her titles or her family name. She spent most of her time alone in the guest quarters that Jake had assigned to her. The room was small but clean and had a window that looked out at the stars. During The long hours she found herself thinking about the rescue and remembering details that had not seemed important at the time. Jake had been wounded when he reached her cage, but he had not stopped to treat his injuries. Even as blood ran down his face, he had worked quickly to free her and the other prisoners. When Corvin soldiers appeared, he had stepped in front of her without hesitation and used his own body as a shield. She remembered the feel of his hands when he helped her through the burning compound. They were rough and calloused from years of hard work, but they had been gentle when he lifted her over obstacles. Even when she tried to pull away, he had not hurt her or used more force than necessary. Most disturbing of all were the looks she had seen in his eyes. There had been no lust or desire like she expected from a primitive species. Instead, she had seen only determination and concern for her safety. He had risked everything to save someone he had never met before and expected nothing in return. On the second day of the journey, Dr. Stevens came to check on her injuries and found her staring out the window with a troubled expression. The doctor sat down in the chair across from her and waited patiently for Zareth to speak. "Tell me about your captain," Zareth said finally. "What kind of man is he?" Dr. Stevens smiled, and her whole face seemed to light up. "Jake Martinez is the best commanding officer I have ever served under. He cares about every person on this ship, like they were his own family. When we lost the Valiant 3 years ago, he spent days searching for survivors, even though command ordered him to withdraw. The Valiant, his previous ship," Dr. Stevens explained. "Pirates attacked a convoy of civilian transports, and Jake led the escort ships into battle. We saved most of the civilians, but the Valiant was destroyed, and half the crew died. Jake blamed himself, even though there was nothing more he could have done." Zareth felt something cold settle in her stomach as she listened to the story. Jake had lost friends and shipmates, trying to protect innocent people, and he had continued doing the same thing ever since. The rescue on Zarian Prime was not unusual for him. It was just another day of putting other people's lives before his own. "Why did he not mention this when I accused him of improper behavior?" she asked. "Because Jake does not talk about his sacrifices," Dr. Stevens replied. "He just makes them and moves on to the next crisis. That is the kind of person he is." That evening, Zareth left her quarters for the first time since boarding the ship and walked through the corridors. She wanted to see more of the human vessel and try to understand the people who had rescued her. What she found surprised her in ways she had not expected. The ship was smaller than most Altarian vessels, but it was well maintained and organized. Every crew member she passed nodded politely to her, even though she had treated them badly. In the engineering section, she saw Ben Torres working on a damaged power coupling that was probably broken during the rescue mission. "Excuse me, Chief Torres," she said as she approached him. "May I ask you a question?" Ben looked up from his work with surprise written on his face. This was the first time the Altarian noble had spoken to him directly since coming aboard. "Sure. Lady Zareth, what do you want to know? Why did you volunteer for the rescue mission?" she asked. "You could have been killed, and you did not even know who we were." Ben set down his tools and thought about the question for a moment. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "There were innocent people being held by slavers, and we had the power to help them. Sometimes that is all the reason you need." The simple honesty of his answer made Zareth feel even worse about her behavior. These humans had risked their lives for strangers, and she had responded by insulting their captain and questioning their motives. She began to understand that her ideas about primitive species had been very wrong. In the communication center, she found Amy Foster monitoring long-range sensors and checking for signs of pursuit. The young woman looked tired, and Zareth realized that the crew had been working extra shifts to get her home safely. "Officer Foster," she said carefully, "I wanted to thank you for your efforts on my behalf. Amy looked surprised, but pleased by the unexpected courtesy. "Just doing my job, ma'am. Captain Martinez wants to make sure you get home safe, and that is what we are going to do, even after the way I have treated all of you." Amy shrugged and gave her a small smile. "The captain says that people sometimes act badly when they are scared. Or hurt. He does not take it personally, and neither do we." That night, Zaret H. lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling while she thought about everything she had learned. The humans on this ship were nothing like what she had been taught to expect from primitive species. They were brave and kind and willing to sacrifice for others without expecting rewards. Most important of all was their captain who had saved her life and then walked away when she insulted him. Jake Martinez could have left her in that cage to teach her a lesson about gratitude. Instead, he had done his job and treated her with respect, even when she showed him none in return. For the first time since her rescue, Zareth began to feel ashamed of her behavior. She had been raised to believe that noble birth made her better than other people, but these humans had shown her what real nobility looked like. It was not about titles or bloodlines. It was about choosing to do the right thing, even when it was difficult or dangerous. She thought about Jake's hands touching her during the rescue and realized that her anger had not really been about cultural taboos. It had been about fear and prejudice and the uncomfortable knowledge that a primitive human had been braver and more honorable than she was. Tomorrow, they would reach Altarian space, and she would return to her old life of privilege and comfort. But she would never forget the lessons she had learned aboard the New Horizon, or the man who... Captain Jake Martinez crouched behind a broken wall and watched the Corvin compound through his scope. The place was bigger than the intelligence reports had suggested, and there were more guards than expected. But his team had come too far to turn back now, and there were innocent people trapped inside who needed help. Jake had been in situations like this before during his 10 years with the Human Space Navy. He knew how to read enemy positions and find weak points in their defenses. The Corvins were tough fighters, but they were not very smart about tactics, and they had made several mistakes that his team could use. "Lisa, what do you see on the east side?" Jake whispered into his communication device. Lieutenant Lisa Chong was positioned on the other side of the compound with half of their assault team. Her voice came back clear and calm. 4 guards at the main entrance and 2 more in the tower. They look relaxed, like they are not expecting trouble. "Good. That means our approach worked," Jake replied. "Ben, are the charges ready?" Chief Engineer Ben Torres had placed explosive charges on the compound's power station and communication array. His job was to cut off the Corvins from outside help and plunge the place into darkness when the attack began. Ready to blow on your signal, Captain Jake looked at his watch and saw that they had been watching the compound for 2 hours. During that time, they had seen the guards change shifts twice and mapped out the patrol routes. The prisoners were being held in a separate building near the center of the compound, and getting to them would not be easy. The mission had started 3 days ago, when the human frigate New Horizon picked up a distress signal from deep space. The signal was weak and broken, but their communications officer, Amy Foster, had managed to clean it up enough to understand the message. An Altarian diplomatic ship had been attacked by raiders, and the crew was presumed dead. Most captains would have reported the incident to higher command and waited for orders. But Jake Martinez was not most captains, and he had a reputation for making his own decisions when lives were at stake. He ordered his ship to follow the signal back to its source and look for survivors. What they found was much worse than a simple pirate attack. The Altarian ship had been captured intact and its crew taken alive for the slave markets. Jake's crew tracked the raiders to Zarian Prime, where they discovered a major slaving operation that had been running for months. The smart thing would have been to call for backup from the human fleet and wait for a proper military response. But intelligence reports showed that a slave auction was scheduled for the next day, and anyone not sold would be killed to eliminate evidence. Jake made the hard choice to attack with just his landing party of 12 Marines. Now they were here, and it was time to act. Jake gave the signal, and Ben triggered the explosives that knocked out power to half the compound. In the confusion that followed, Jake's team moved fast and hit the guards before they could organize a proper defense. The attack was loud and violent, but also very quick. Human Marines were trained to move fast and strike hard before the enemy could react. Within minutes, they had fought their way through the outer defenses and were inside the compound looking for the prisoners. Jake led the way through dark corridors while his team covered the flanks and watched for ambushes. The Corvins were fighting back, but they were scattered and confused by the sudden attack. Most of them had never faced human troops before and were not prepared for their speed and aggression. "Contact left," Lisa called out as 3 Corvin soldiers appeared from a side passage. Her energy rifle barked twice, and 2 of the aliens went down hard. The third one tried to run, but Ben Torres was waiting around the corner and finished him with a single shot. They found the prison section after 10 minutes of fighting through the compound. The building was separate from the main structures and had its own power system that was still working. Through the windows, they could see dozens of cages filled with prisoners from many different species. "There are so many of them," Amy Foster whispered as she looked through her scope at the prison building. She was normally stationed on the ship, but had volunteered for the mission. Because they needed every person they could get, Jake studied the building and counted at least 30. Guards inside, plus an unknown number in the upper levels. Getting the prisoners out would be the hardest part of the mission, because the Corvins would use them as shields once they realized what was happening. "We go in fast and hard," Jake told his team. "Lisa, take your squad through the main entrance and draw their attention. Ben, take the back door and work your way up. I will go for the high-value prisoners in the center section." The assault on the prison building was even more intense than the attack on the compound. The Corvins fought desperately because they knew their whole operation was at stake. Energy. Weapons fired in all directions, and the air filled with smoke and the smell of earned metal. Jake fought his way through 2 levels of the building and found himself in a corridor lined with small cages. Most of the prisoners were huddled in the back of their cells, trying to stay out of the line of fire. But one cage held a figure that stood tall and proud, despite the chaos around them. Lady Zarath watched the human soldier approach her cage, and felt a mixture of hope and fear. He was not very tall compared to most aliens, but he moved with the confidence of someone who had been in many fights. His uniform was torn and dirty from the battle, and there was blood on his hands from wear. He had been cut by flying debris. "Are you Lady Zarath of House Valthera?" Jake asked, as he worked to open her cage with tools from his belt. "Yes, I am," she replied in Galactic Common. "Are you here to rescue me?" "That is the plan," Jake said as the cage door swung open. "But we need to move fast, because this place is coming down around us." As if to prove his point, an explosion shook. The building and pieces of the ceiling fell near their feet. Somewhere above them, Jake could hear Ben Torres shouting orders to his squad as they fought their way through the upper levels. The sounds of battle were getting closer, and that meant Corvin reinforcements were arriving. Jake reached out and grabbed Zarath by the arm to pull her from the cage. The moment his rough human skin touched her smooth blue flesh, she jerked back like she had been burned. Her eyes went wide with shock and something that looked like disgust. "Do not touch me," she said in a voice that was cold and angry. "I am nobility, and you have no right to put your hands on me." Jake stared at her for a moment like he could not believe what he was hearing. Around them, the building was shaking from explosions and guards were shooting at anything that moved. This was not the time for alien customs and protocols. "Lady, I am trying to save your life," he said as another piece of ceiling crashed down nearby. "We can discuss proper etiquette later when we are not about to die." Before she could argue, Jake grabbed her arm again and pulled her out of the cage. This time he did not let go, even though she tried to pull away. His grip was firm but not painful, and he moved with the smooth motions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. They ran through corridors filled with smoke and debris, while Jake's team covered their escape. More than once he had to shield Zareth with his own body when Corvin soldiers appeared and started shooting. Each time his arms went around her, she felt the solid strength of his muscles and the warmth of his human body. The way out of the compound was a running battle that seemed to last forever. Jake never let go of her hand as he led her through the maze of buildings and defensive positions. When she stumbled, he caught her, and when debris blocked their path, he lifted her over it without asking permission. By the time they reached the landing zone, where the human shuttle was waiting, Zareth was exhausted and covered in dust. Jake helped her into the shuttle and made sure she was secure before turning to help load the other rescued prisoners. Only then did she realize that he had been wounded during the rescue and was bleeding from cuts on his arms and face. The shuttle lifted off just as Corvin reinforcements arrived at the compound. Through the window, Zareth could see the fires burning where the humans had fought their way in and out. The whole operation had taken less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. As they flew toward the human ship, Jake finally had time to check on the rescued prisoners. Most of them were in shock, but grateful to be free. When he came to Zareth, she was sitting alone and staring out the window with an expression he could not read. "Are you injured, Lady Zareth?" he asked in a voice that was professional but kind. She looked up at him and for the first time really saw the man who had risked his life to save her. His uniform was torn and bloody, and he looked tired in a way that went deeper than just physical exhaustion. But his eyes were steady and calm, like someone who had done the right thing and knew it. "You touched me," she said, and her voice was full of anger and something else that might have been shame. "You put your primitive hands on my skin without permission, and you have dishonored me in ways you cannot understand." Lady Zareth of House Velthera stood at the tall window of her private chambers aboard the diplomatic vessel and watched the stars shift as they moved through space toward Zarian Prime. Her blue skin caught the light from the ship's systems and made her look almost like she was glowing. The crystalline patterns on her forehead marked her as nobility among the Altarian people, and she wore them with pride like her ancestors had done for thousands of years. The mission to Zarian Prime was supposed to be simple and safe. The planet had valuable minerals that the Altarian Empire needed, and the local government had agreed to trade talks. Zareth was chosen to lead the talks because she was smart and came from an important family. Her father, Lord Kethara, had trained her well in the art of making deals, and she had never failed before. But things went wrong as soon as their ship entered Zarian space. Instead of the friendly welcome they expected, the Altarians found Corvon raiders waiting for them. The Corvins were known across the galaxy as slavers and pirates who took people to sell in dark markets. They had somehow learned about the diplomatic mission and planned an ambush. The attack was fast and brutal. Corvin ships surrounded the Altarian vessel and disabled its weapons with ion cannons. The diplomatic ship tried to run, but the raiders had brought too many ships and blocked every escape route. Within an hour, the proud Altarian vessel was captured and its crew taken prisoner. Zareth fought as hard as she could when the Corvins boarded her ship. She had learned combat skills as part of her noble training, but the raiders came in large numbers and used stun weapons. The last thing she remembered was a Corvin soldier pointing an energy weapon at her before everything went dark. When she woke up, she found herself in a small metal cage inside what looked like a prison compound. The air smelled bad, and the walls were covered with rust and dirt. Other prisoners sat in cages around her, and most of them looked scared and hopeless. Some were from species she had never seen before, and others were clearly from civilized worlds. Like her own, a large Corvan guard walked past her cage and stopped to look at her with his cold yellow eyes. He had scars on his face and arms that showed he had been in many fights. When he smiled, his sharp teeth made him look even more dangerous than before. "Well, well, what do we have here?" the guard said in rough galactic common language. "A pretty blue princess all locked up like a pet bird." Zareth stood up straight and tried to look as noble as possible, even though she was trapped. "I am Lady Zareth of House Velthera, and daughter of Lord Kethara. The Altarian Empire will pay well for my safe return and punish those who harm me." The guard laughed, and the sound was not pleasant. "The Empire is very far away, little princess, and no one knows where you are. But you are right about one thing. Someone will pay well for you. Noble Altarian females bring top prices in the slave markets." The words hit Zareth like a physical blow. She had always known that such terrible things happened in the galaxy, but they happened to other people in faraway places. She was nobility, and nobility was protected by law and custom and the power of great families. The idea that she could be sold like property was too horrible to accept. "You cannot do this," she said, but her voice was not as strong as before. "I have diplomatic immunity, and my people will come for me." "Your people think you died in the attack," another Corvan said as he joined the first guard. This one was older and had the look of someone in charge. "We made sure your ship sent a distress signal saying all hands were lost. Very sad accident in deep space. Happens all the time." The reality of her situation began to sink in, and Zareth felt fear like she had never known before. She was alone and far from home, with no one coming to save her. The Corvans had planned everything carefully and covered their tracks well. Even if someone suspected the truth, it would take time to investigate, and time was something she did not have. Days passed in the prison compound, and Zareth learned more about her captors and their operation. The Corvans had built their base on Zerian Prime because the planet was far from major trade routes and had no strong government to interfere with their business. They raided ships throughout the sector and brought their prisoners here to be sorted and prepared for sale. The compound was large and well defended with energy barriers and guard towers. Dozens of Corvan soldiers patrolled the area, and the prisoners were kept in separate sections based on their species and value. Zareth was placed with other high-value captives who would bring good prices from wealthy buyers. She tried to stay strong and maintain her dignity, but it was hard when she was given scraps to eat and had to use a bucket for waste. The other prisoners told her stories about what happened to slaves in different parts of the galaxy, and none of the stories had happy endings. Some were bought by crime bosses who used them for dangerous work, and others were sold to rich collectors who wanted exotic pets. One morning, Zareth woke up to find the guards more active than usual. They were checking weapons and talking in excited voices about something. When she asked another prisoner what was happening, she was told that a buyer was coming to look at the merchandise. "Big sale today," said an old man from Rigel who had been captured months before. "The boss has been talking about it for weeks. Someone with lots of money wants to buy the best prisoners." Zareth felt sick as she realized what this meant. Soon she would be taken from this awful place, but only to be given to someone even worse. She had heard stories about what happened to slaves who were bought by private collectors, and the stories made her want to hide in the corner of her cage. But she was nobility, and nobility did not hide. She stood up straight and prepared to face whatever came next with as much dignity as she could manage. If these were to be her last hours of freedom, then she would use them to remember who she was and where she came from, the compound's alarm systems suddenly started making noise and red lights began flashing everywhere. Guards ran past her cage, carrying weapons and shouting orders in the Corvan language. Something was happening, and it was something the guards had not expected. Through the small window in her cage, Zareth could see explosions in the distance, and the bright flashes of energy weapons being fired. Someone was attacking the compound, and the Corvans were fighting back hard. She pressed her face against the bars and tried to see more, but the action was too far away. "What is happening?" she called to the other prisoners, but they looked just as confused as she felt. The sounds of fighting grew closer, and Zareth could hear the high-pitched whine of human energy weapons mixed with the deeper sounds of Corvan guns. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy, and most aliens thought they were just another primitive species that had recently learned to travel between stars. But the weapons fire was getting closer to the prison compound, and that meant someone was winning the fight. Zareth allowed herself to hope for the first time since her capture that maybe rescue was coming after all.